I remember the first sound before everything turned into a blur of spinning sky and fractured light, the sharp crack of a wine glass hitting the wooden deck and shattering near my feet, a thin, bright note rising through the warm Montana air as conversations faltered and the Carter family reunion shifted into something far darker than any of us expected. I had been sitting in my new charcoal gray wheelchair trying to steady my breathing while pretending the knots in my stomach were simple nerves and not the weight of 2 years of avoidance resentment and unsaid grief. And I kept telling myself that today had to go well because I had come here to show that I could still belong to this family. Across the tables, my brother Mark was already on his third drink and playing the role he loved most, which was the charming, loud favorite son who carried the family pride like a trophy, yet never acknowledged how many responsibilities everyone else quietly shouldered to protect him from the consequences of his own recklessness. My young cousin Jess was wandering around with her phone lifted high doing a live stream for her friends, even though no one had asked her to film anything, and she occasionally swung the camera toward me like she was documenting some rare exhibit that made her laugh without understanding how deeply her gaze made me shrink. Mark noticed her attention drifting toward me, and he smirked in a way I knew too well before raising his voice to announce that the star of the show had finally come out of hiding, and maybe she would treat us to another performance of her inspirational routine, where she pretended to be braver than she really was. A few people chuckled in that uneasy way families laugh when they do not know whether a comment is meant to be harmless or cruel, but their hesitation only encouraged Mark to lean into the cruelty with the confidence of a man who believed he would never be corrected because he had never been corrected before. He approached me with a swagger that made my pulse kick faster, and he said that maybe I should stand up and make a toast since I had been sitting long enough and everyone knew I loved attention more than any of them even before my unfortunate little accident became the most convenient excuse of my life. Something in me snapped at that moment because I had spent 2 years carrying the blame for his choices and now he was parading my injury like a joke, so I told him to stop speaking about things he did not understand and to leave me alone if he could not show basic decency. The shift in his expression was instant, as if my small act of defiance cracked the mask he wore and revealed the anger that simmered beneath it, and he stepped closer until I could smell the alcohol on his breath, while everyone around us pretended not to see what was unfolding. He hissed that I had ruined his life long ago, and that I had no right to embarrass him in front of the family, and before I could respond, he moved behind my chair with a quickness I did not expect because he had never touched my wheelchair before, not even once. I felt the sudden violent force of his hands pressing hard against the handles, and the world pitched forward as the chair shot ahead faster than my body could react, while scattered voices gasped but did not intervene as if frozen in disbelief. I slid forward in a helpless arc, my palms grazing the armrests for a fraction of a second before gravity yanked me out of the seat and I crashed face first into the edge of the long buffet table, the sound of impact echoing inside my skull like a dull, collapsing bell. For half a heartbeat, there was complete silence, and then a few startled laughs bubbled up from somewhere behind me as if some people truly believed this was another mistake or clumsy mishap instead of an act of aggression carried out in plain sight. My vision split into streaks of white and red as warm liquid trickled down my forehead, and I could hear distant voices arguing about whether I was faking or overreacting again, because apparently my pain was easier to entertain than to acknowledge. My limbs began to fade from my awareness as the ground tilted under me, and I heard someone whisper that I always chose the most dramatic moments to fall, which made another round of uncertain laughter ripple through the crowd. Then a new voice cut through the confusion with sharp authority as Dr. Lauren Whitfield rushed forward, identifying herself as a trauma specialist and ordering everyone to move back immediately because this was not a joke and I might have suffered a severe spinal injury. She knelt beside me while gripping my wrist to check my pulse, and she shouted at the few relatives reaching toward me not to touch me because any movement could worsen the damage, and they needed to call emergency services right now. Her voice was the last clear thing I remember before the haze closed in and the colors smeared together, and the laughter faded into a hollow echo replaced by the ringing in my ears that grew louder with every passing second. The world narrowed into a tunnel of dimming light and drifting pain, and the final sensation I felt before consciousness slipped away was the warmth of my own blood sliding past my cheek onto the wooden planks beneath me. 2 hours before everything shattered into sirens and fractured light, I remember rolling up to the edge of my parents' long gravel driveway with my hands damp against the wheels because I had been rehearsing what I would say for days. Yet nothing felt right once the moment finally arrived, and the familiar outline of the Carter Ranch spread in front of me like a memory I was not sure I wanted to reclaim. The new wheelchair felt too smooth under my palms, as though it belonged to a stronger version of myself I had not yet learned to trust, and each small bump in the gravel reminded me that coming back here meant reopening wounds that never fully closed, no matter how hard I pretended otherwise. I sat there for almost a full minute watching the summer banners sway in the warm Montana breeze and listening to the faint sounds of music and laughter drifting from the backyard, where everyone was already gathering for the annual reunion that I had skipped for 2 straight years after the accident that changed everything. My stomach tightened at the thought of seeing Mark again, because every memory of him lately was tied to that night when the rain blurred the windshield, and the argument he was having with his girlfriend over the phone made him drive faster, even as I begged him to slow down or let me take the wheel before he got us both killed. I tried to push that scene away because this visit was supposed to be about healing. At least that was what I told myself when I agreed to come, after Grandma Rose called me and said she did not know how many more summers she would have left, and she wanted to see her granddaughter smiling in her backyard again. The way she said backyard carried so much warmth that for a moment I forgot the coldness of my parents' voices during our last phone call when they hinted that maybe I had exaggerated the severity of my injury for sympathy, and Mark did not mean to crash the car that night, so I should try to move on like everyone else. I wheeled closer to the porch, thinking about how many times I had walked up these steps on my own 2 feet, without ever imagining that one day I would approach them in a chair and feel like the house itself was taller and harder to face than I remembered. The screen door opened suddenly, and my mother stepped out wearing an apron dusted with flour, as if she had been trying to hide her nervousness in the kitchen. But when she saw me, her expression flickered somewhere between relief and discomfort, which told me she had been preparing herself for this moment just as anxiously as I had. She said, "Emily, you look good," which was the safest sentence she could have chosen, and I thanked her, even though good felt like an odd word, considering how long it had taken me to convince myself that I had any worth left after the accident and the months of physical therapy that followed. My father joined her a moment later, wiping his hands on a towel and offering me a stiff half-smile that did not quite reach his eyes as he said, "We are glad you made it, kid," even though his tone suggested he was more relieved that I had not backed out at the last minute, rather than genuinely happy to see me. They helped clear a path through the doorway, even though I did not ask for assistance, and I rolled inside, feeling the familiar smell of pine wood and old photographs which filled the house with a history that seemed heavier now that I carried my own fragile version of it. As I crossed the living room, I saw the framed picture of Mark and me from our childhood hanging above the fireplace, and for a moment I stared at it, wondering when exactly the closeness we once had dissolved into something sharp and bitter. Back then, Mark had been the protective older brother who defended me from bullies and snuck cookies into my backpack before school, but as we grew older, that protectiveness twisted into something controlling and impatient, until I became the easy target blamed for anything that went wrong in his life. When we were teenagers, he called me soft whenever I showed emotion and said I needed to toughen up or the world would crush me, and now that I thought about it, maybe he had been practicing that crushing long before the night of the accident. My mother urged me to join everyone outside before the food got cold, and I nodded, even though a subtle ache had begun in my chest, the kind that comes from knowing you are walking willingly into a storm that already has your name written in it. I followed her through the hallway toward the back doors while trying to ignore the faint tremor in my hands and rehearsing again the speech I had prepared about forgiving the past and moving forward, even though I still did not know whether Mark deserved any part of that forgiveness. When I reached the threshold and heard the burst of laughter from the yard, I took a deep breath because despite everything, I wanted this to work. I wanted my family to see me not as someone broken or inconvenient, but as someone who survived something unimaginable and still showed up. I rolled over the wooden deck boards, feeling the sun warm my shoulders, and for a brief, fragile moment, I let myself imagine that this day could end differently than every fearful scenario I had pictured, though deep inside a small part of me sensed that the peace I hoped for was not the peace I was about to receive. When I reached the backyard, the full scene of the Carter family reunion spread out before me in a way that was both familiar and unsettling. Because while the warm Montana sun painted everything in soft gold, there was an undercurrent buzzing beneath the laughter that made my skin prickle as though my presence had shifted the atmosphere without anyone acknowledging it directly. Long folding tables were draped in red and white checkered cloths and stacked with trays of barbecue ribs, cornbread bowls of potato salad, pitchers of sweet tea and lemonade, and the thick, smoky scent rising from the grill wrapped around the yard like a memory from the summers when I used to help Dad flip burgers before everything changed. Children chased each other across the lawn, shouting with careless joy, while older relatives lounged in lawn chairs trading stories that had been told so many times they no longer remembered which parts were true and which parts had been embellished over the years. My mother moved among the guests with an anxious sort of energy, smoothing tablecloths, fixing hair, brushing crumbs out of sight, as though she could manage her worry by managing the environment around her, and every now and then she glanced at me with a tight smile that seemed to plead, "Please, let today stay peaceful." My father stood near the grill, talking loudly with Uncle Ron about cattle prices and drought seasons and pretending not to see me, though I noticed the way his shoulders stiffened each time someone glanced in my direction, which told me he was more aware of me than he wanted to admit. Grandma Rose sat beneath the shade of the large oak tree, wrapped in a soft, mint-colored shawl, even though the day was warm. Her frail hands folded neatly in her lap while she watched everything with eyes that still carried the wisdom of 9 decades. And when she saw me approach, she opened her arms with a tenderness that made my throat tighten. I rolled toward her and she squeezed my hands, whispering that she had prayed I would come because families do not heal by pretending distance will fix what silence only deepens, and I felt a flicker of warmth in my chest because she had always been the only one who understood the difference between withdrawing for survival and withdrawing for punishment. But the moment I looked beyond her, I caught sight of Mark leaning against the cooler with a beer in his hand, laughing too loudly at something one of our cousins said, and the way his eyes narrowed when they found mine told me that my arrival was not part of the version of today he had intended to enjoy. He lifted his bottle in a mock toast and nodded toward me with a smirk that carried more warning than welcome, and the easy charm he projected for the audience around him was the same mask he had worn for years, the one that made people believe he was simply misunderstood rather than destructive. Then there was Aunt Linda bustling around with her camera trying to capture candid photos of everyone while shouting instructions about angles and lighting, even though no one asked her to document every second of the day, and she paused briefly when she spotted me before forcing a cheerful expression and snapping a picture without permission. Cousin Jess hovered nearby, still live streaming with the eagerness of someone who believed every private moment was content for public consumption, and when she realized I had noticed, she giggled and said her followers loved authentic family gatherings, which made me feel strangely exposed, as though I had stepped into a spotlight I never asked for. Even younger cousins who barely remembered the accident stared at me with a mix of curiosity and confusion, whispering questions to their parents, who quickly hushed them or redirected their attention toward the slip and slide at the far end of the yard. The dissonance between the cheerful appearance of the reunion and the tension beneath it pressed on me with every breath, and I struggled to maintain a calm expression as I wheeled toward a table near the oak tree, hoping to anchor myself before the discomfort swelling inside me burst into full visibility. I tried to focus on the sounds of children laughing, the hum of conversation, and the rustle of the breeze pushing through the tall grass beyond the fence, but my eyes kept drifting back to the faces of relatives who watched me with polite curiosity or awkward pity, neither of which offered any real comfort. I wondered how many of them truly believed the version of events my parents and Mark had insisted on telling. How many accepted the lie that I had been driving the car the night of the accident, and how many quietly suspected the truth, but chose loyalty over integrity because confronting Mark would disrupt the fragile balance the family clung to. My breath caught when I noticed the pitying glances deepening each time someone whispered something in a neighbor's ear because I could practically feel the judgments forming whether they thought I had come back seeking sympathy or attention or reconciliation that I had not earned simply because I had kept my distance. A strange mix of longing and dread rose in me because part of me wished someone would walk over, sit down beside me, and ask how I had really been, while another part feared what it would feel like if no one did, and I remained a quiet spectacle on the edge of the celebration. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of grilled meat and wild sage toward me, and for a fleeting second, I tried to imagine what this day would have felt like in another version of my life. One where Mark had not been drinking that night, one where the crash never happened, one where I could stand on my own feet and move freely through the yard without feeling like I needed to justify my presence. But as I watched the people around me weaving through their conversations, oblivious to the storm that had been building inside me since the moment I arrived, I sensed that today was not going to stay peaceful for long, and the part of me that had come hoping for healing trembled with the quiet understanding that some wounds do not close just because we wish them to. I had been pretending to blend into the reunion for nearly 20 minutes when it happened, the first public humiliation, the moment everyone would later claim they barely noticed, even though their laughter echoed loud enough to leave a bruise on my memory. Mark drifted toward me with the deliberate swagger of a man who believed the yard belonged to him, weaving through relatives who greeted him like he was the prodigal son returning home rather than the reason I had spent 2 years relearning how to exist in a broken body. He carried a half-empty beer bottle and a grin sharpened at the edges by alcohol and entitlement, and when he finally stopped in front of me, he tilted his head just enough to signal to the nearest group that a show was about to start. "Well, look at you, Emily," he said with feigned surprise, as though I had not been sitting in plain sight since I arrived all dressed up like you are still part of the family. His voice carried across the tables, and several cousins turned to watch because Mark had always known how to command attention, and cruelty was his favorite stage. I kept my tone steady as I said hello, hoping my calm would disarm him, but he smirked at the wheelchair instead of my face and tapped the metal frame with his shoe like it was a prop he found amusing. "You roll in here with this thing like you want everyone to feel sorry for you," he said with a chuckle that spread quickly to the people around him, and his words hit me with that familiar sting. The one that always came when someone in this family mistook my survival for manipulation. Aunt Linda laughed softly behind her cup of sweet tea and whispered something to Uncle Ron, who grinned like this was harmless teasing, and I suddenly felt the air tighten around me as though the whole yard leaned in waiting for me to react in a way that would justify their discomfort. Mark crouched slightly so he could speak into my face, his breath laced with beer and arrogance, and muttered that he had told everyone the real reason I used a wheelchair, what he called my dramatic flair, because according to him, the doctors said I could walk if I really wanted to, but I enjoyed the attention too much to try. I felt the blood drain from my face because the lie was not new, but hearing it announced publicly with such ease made something inside me recoil with both shame and fury. And I glanced at the circle forming around us, hoping someone, anyone, would speak up and say that what he said was wrong. Instead, they watched, entertained by his cruelty, unwilling to break from the collective delusion that Mark was harmless if you learned not to take him seriously. I forced myself to inhale slowly the way my therapist taught me, and replied that my spinal injury was real, medically documented, the reason I had spent months in physical rehab, while Mark was out drinking with friends pretending none of it had happened. But he laughed loudly and stood up straight, raising his beer in a dramatic toast that made several relatives smile, declaring that Emily always had a flair for exaggeration and that I had always been too sensitive to take a joke. His words flowed over the crowd like a toxin disguised as humor, and I saw the ripple effect of avoidance and discomfort spreading across the faces of people who knew better but did not dare challenge him because keeping peace in this family always meant sacrificing truth. My mother hurried over, attempting to smooth the situation by placing a trembling hand on my shoulder and whispering that I should not let small comments ruin the reunion because Mark did not mean anything by it, and if I reacted, he would only escalate. It was the same message I had been given my entire life. Suppress your pain to protect his ego. stay quiet to preserve the image of a stable family, even when stability required me to disappear. But something cracked open inside me, then a small but powerful fracture in my patience, and I straightened in my chair just enough to say loudly enough for people nearby to hear that I was not being sensitive, I was being harassed. A brief flicker of surprise crossed my mother's face, as though she had not expected me to defend myself. But before she could respond, Mark leaned in again, eyes gleaming with triumph that I had finally taken the bait. He announced to the entire yard that Emily thinks I am a threat, which is hilarious considering she is the one who ruins every family event by making everything about her disability. A few people laughed nervously, clearly unsure whether they were supposed to find this funny but unwilling to risk aligning with the wrong side. The heat rushed to my cheeks and my heart pounded so hard it felt like the world was narrowing around me into a single humiliating spotlight where I was trapped and exposed. I tried to speak, but the moment my mouth opened, Mark cut me off, shouting that he was just being honest, and at least he was not lying about what really happened the night of the accident like I had. His words sliced through me with surgical precision because he knew exactly where my deepest wounds were buried, and he was unearthing them in front of everyone. A hush fell over the nearby tables as people leaned in, pretending not to listen while absorbing every detail, and I felt something inside me snap a quiet, brittle break that tasted like exhaustion and rage wrapped together. I told Mark to stop, my voice shaking but loud enough to carry across the yard, and for the first time in 2 years, I did not back down, did not fold, did not shrink into the background to make him comfortable. That was the moment his expression changed, shifting from mockery to something darker, something territorial and dangerous, as though my refusal to submit had bruised his pride in front of the family he believed he controlled. He stepped closer until his shadow fell over me and whispered that I should not embarrass him. Not today, not in front of everyone, because he always had the power to put me back in my place. Before I could respond, he straightened, turned toward the crowd, and announced that I was overreacting again and that someone like me needed to lighten up if I wanted to be part of the family. The laughter resumed thin and brittle, but still loud enough to carve itself into my memory, and I felt a tremor move through my arms as I gripped the sides of my wheelchair, trying to hold myself together, while the humiliation thickened in the air like heat before a storm. I knew then with chilling certainty that this day was unraveling fast, and no matter how much I wished otherwise, something terrible was coming because cruelty like Mark's never ended with words alone. The moment Mark hurled the accusation about the accident into the air, the atmosphere around me tightened like an invisible rope, because even though most of the family pretended not to know the details, everyone remembered the night. Everything in my life changed, and the lies that followed had shaped the way they saw me ever since. I felt a sharp jolt in my chest as memories surged through me, vivid and merciless, pulling me back to the night 2 years ago when I had been sitting in the passenger seat of Mark's old truck while he drove recklessly down Highway 12, the road lit only by scattered moonlight and the intermittent glow of passing ranch houses. I remembered begging him to slow down as he swerved slightly, his grip on the wheel loose and sloppy because he had been drinking since late afternoon, but insisted he was fine, that he knew every curve of this road better than anyone. He had been furious after another explosive fight with his girlfriend and had refused to let me call for help or ask someone else to drive, claiming he needed to clear his head, as though speeding through darkness could erase the consequences of his choices. I remembered staring at his profile, the sharpness of his jaw, the way his mouth twisted whenever he felt challenged, and I whispered his name with trembling urgency, telling him that we should pull over, that he was going too fast, that the truck was drifting toward the shoulder. But he snapped at me to stop acting like a mother, that I always tried to control him, that I should relax because nothing was going to happen. And the words had hung in the cab, thick with irritation and bravado, moments before the truck veered sharply as his phone buzzed on the console. He glanced down for a second to read a text from the same girlfriend he claimed to be done with, and that fraction of hesitation sealed everything that came after. Because when his eyes returned to the road, the headlights illuminated the massive elk standing directly in our lane, frozen by the glare. Mark cursed and jerked the wheel, but the truck fishtailed wildly, the tires skidding across gravel and dirt, and I felt the world tilt violently as we spun toward the ditch just beyond the tree line. My body lifted weightless for a moment before the crash slammed into us with bone-shattering force, metal twisting around me like a crushing fist. And the last thing I remembered before darkness swallowed everything was the sound of Mark screaming and the sickening crunch of my spine against the doorframe. When I woke in the hospital 3 days later, unable to feel anything below my waist, the sterile white ceiling blurred through tears that would not stop coming because I already sensed that life as I knew it had vanished in that single catastrophic impact. My parents stood beside the bed, pale and frantic, but instead of asking if I remembered what happened, their first questions were about Mark, whether I intended to tell the police that he had been driving, whether I understood how much trouble he would be in if the truth came out. The betrayal carved itself into my heart, as my father explained that if Mark was charged, it would ruin his future, his career, his standing in the community, and that we needed to protect him because the accident had been terrible enough without adding legal consequences and public shame. They insisted that the family image mattered more than blame, that we were Carters and Carters did not turn on each other even though the request was really an order wrapped in trembling voices and parental pressure. I could not fight in those first fragile days after my surgery. When the police came to take my statement, my mother squeezed my hand hard enough to hurt, reminding me with silent desperation that telling the truth would destroy my brother and destroy us all. And in my confusion and grief, I let their fear override my own and whispered that I did not remember who was driving. Mark never thanked me for saving him from a criminal charge, never apologized for putting me in that truck in the first place, never visited during my months of rehabilitation, and never acknowledged the role he played in the moment that severed my mobility. Instead, he began spreading the story that the accident was partly my fault, that I was dramatic and emotional, which made him lose control, that I had exaggerated my injuries to gain sympathy even though he had seen the medical records that proved the severity of my spinal fracture. Over time, the lie took root because my parents repeated it enough times to make it seem plausible, and relatives accepted the soft version of the truth, because it was easier to believe than the reality that one of their own had nearly killed his sister through recklessness and pride. I spent months in a rehabilitation center learning how to balance, how to transfer from bed to chair, how to navigate a world that suddenly towered above me in ways I had never noticed before, while Mark went on with his life, bragging about how lucky we all were that things had not turned out worse. I reread the surgeon's notes countless times. The words spinal cord trauma, T12 complete, injury, permanent mobility loss burned into my memory like a branding iron because the severity of my condition contradicted every lie my family fed the community and themselves. The truth stayed buried because confronting it would require someone to face the guilt they had been avoiding since the moment the police left the hospital room, and no one wanted to be the one to unravel the illusion of unity the Carters worked so hard to maintain. By the time I was strong enough emotionally to challenge what happened, I no longer lived at home, and the family narrative had grown roots too deep to pull out without tearing everything apart, so I let distance become my form of survival. But now, standing in the present with Mark laughing at my paralysis like it was a punchline, I felt the truth rising in me with the force of something that had waited too long to be spoken, and I realized with a slow, steady clarity that I would not let him rewrite my life story one more time. Not here, not today, not ever again. The tension in the backyard thickened after Mark's cruel remarks, settling over the reunion like an invisible fog that wrapped itself around every conversation and every sideways glance. And although people tried to continue eating ribs and laughing at old family stories, the rhythm of the day had changed because my presence had become the silent fault line beneath everyone's feet. I could feel the shift in the air as one relative after another stole quick, uncertain looks toward me, their expressions mixing discomfort, curiosity, and a strange hunger for drama because nothing energized this family like the scent of conflict. Mark noticed too, and his ego swelled with the attention as he strutted from group to group, reenacting the exchange between us with exaggerated gestures and mocking tones that earned chuckles from cousins who should have known better. He passed by the grill where Dad was flipping burgers, and I saw my father give him a weary, half-hearted smile that carried resignation rather than correction, a silent approval that made my stomach twist with the familiar ache of being the expendable child. Every few minutes, one of the younger relatives drifted close enough to me that I could hear snippets of their whispered conversations. Words like pretending, maybe she can walk attention seeker floating through the hot afternoon air like sparks looking for something to ignite. The sun beat down on the tables, making the lemonade glisten and the aluminum trays shimmer, but all I could feel was a slow, growing unease in my chest, as if my body sensed danger long before I could admit it out loud. A young cousin named Becky, who had been live streaming earlier, now held her phone pointed subtly in my direction, capturing reactions rather than conversations, because she had discovered that digital attention was more intoxicating than a family reunion could ever be. Her amused smirk each time she glanced toward me made it clear she was waiting for something dramatic to happen, something she could show her online followers as if my life pain and history were nothing more than potential entertainment. I tried to stay calm, focusing on Grandma Rose, who sat beneath the oak tree watching everything with worried eyes and occasionally pressing a tissue to her nose, as though the chaos of the day had worn down even her gentle spirit. She motioned for me to come closer, and when I rolled toward her, she took my hand, whispering that Mark had always been a storm, and storms did not know how to love gently, which made my throat tighten. But before she could say more, Mom appeared between us, forcing a tight smile as she asked if everything was all right in a tone that suggested she hoped desperately that I would say yes, so the illusion of family harmony could remain intact for at least a few more hours. I nodded, even though the heaviness in my chest was beginning to feel like a physical weight pressing down on my ribs, and I wondered whether Mom truly did not see what was happening, or if she simply refused to let herself acknowledge it because acknowledging it would mean confronting her own role in allowing Mark's cruelty to flourish unchecked. The afternoon dragged on with pockets of escalating tension as Mark found new excuses to humiliate me. Small verbal jabs disguised as jokes, sharp comments delivered with a charming grin meant to downplay their venom, and a constant need to assert dominance in front of anyone who would watch. At one point, he passed behind me and flicked the back of my wheelchair as though testing its durability, and when I startled, he laughed loudly, announcing to a nearby uncle that I reacted just like a frightened cat, which earned another round of cheap laughter from people who seemed relieved to have an easy target to bond over. My jaw clenched hard enough to hurt, and my hands trembled against the wheels as I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting silently the way my therapist had taught me during panic attacks while reminding myself that walking away was not an option in a chair. I wanted to leave, but Grandma Rose had begged me earlier to give the family one more chance, and I knew that disappointing her would break my heart even more than enduring the cruelty around me. But even as I stayed near her, hoping her presence would keep Mark away, he approached again from across the yard, his steps unsteady and aggressive, as though the beer had amplified both his confidence and his bitterness. He stopped in front of me, narrowing his eyes at the simple carbon frame of my wheelchair, which he had fixated on since the moment I arrived, and said loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear that someone like me should not be allowed to attend reunions looking like a victim when everyone else was here to celebrate. I felt Grandma Rose's hand tighten around mine, but before either of us could respond, Cousin Brian muttered under his breath for Mark to calm down, and that tiny hint of defiance sparked something dark in my brother, who turned sharply toward Brian with a glare that could cut steel. The yard fell into a hush as tension spiraled upward, because everyone sensed that the fragile balance was collapsing quickly, and no one knew what line Mark might cross next now that alcohol rage and bruised pride were mixing dangerously inside him. My pulse hammered as I tried to maneuver my chair slightly backward to put some distance between us, but the uneven grass made the wheels dip, and I had to steady myself with both hands, while Mark watched with that cruel, calculating gleam in his eyes, the same one he had the night he insisted on driving instead of letting me take the wheel. I heard someone whisper that I should not have come at all, that my presence had ruined the atmosphere, that Mark was only acting out because he felt provoked, and those words sliced through me with a familiar coldness, because they mirrored the excuses my family had made for him my entire life. Becky's phone was raised again, catching every shift in expression. Every tremble in my hands, every smirk on Mark's face, and the deep humiliation of being recorded like entertainment made the back of my neck burn. My breath quickened, and for the first time that afternoon, I felt a desperate urge to scream or demand help or simply disappear. But instead, I forced myself to sit still, pretending that I was composed, even though dread was rolling through me in waves. The tension swelled until it felt like the yard was holding its breath, waiting for someone to break the silence, and Mark clearly sensed the weight of the moment because he stepped closer, moved behind me, and placed his hand on the handles of my wheelchair in a way that made my entire body stiffen with instinctive fear. He leaned forward close enough that I could smell the alcohol on his breath and whispered that he was tired of me acting like I was better than him, tired of me ruining every event, tired of my existence, reminding him of the night he refused to take responsibility. Then he straightened, looked out at the yard, and I saw something terrifying in his expression, the spark of a man who had decided that he needed to make a point, one that no one in the family would forget. And before I could fully process the danger building in him, the moment snapped into motion, leading toward the disaster I had sensed from the moment I arrived. The moment Mark's hand tightened around the handles of my wheelchair, the world seemed to contract into a single trembling point of awareness, because every instinct I possessed screamed that something irreversible was about to happen, and yet the yard remained suspended in a strange hush, as if even the wind had paused to witness the cruelty that was about to unfold. I felt the pressure of his grip radiate down the metal frame into my spine, and despite the warmth of the summer afternoon, a chill swept across my skin, as though my body already understood what my mind refused to believe, that my own brother was capable of harming me in front of our entire family. He straightened slowly, scanning the gathering with the false confidence of a man who had always been rewarded for his worst impulses, and I saw the shift in his eyes, that dangerous flicker of satisfaction that came whenever he sensed he held power over someone unable to fight back. The laughter drifting from the tables faded into a murmur as conversations faltered and more people turned their attention toward us, drawn by the rising electricity in the air and the subtle instinct that something was spiraling out of control. Mark's breath brushed the back of my neck as he leaned forward and said loudly enough for the nearest relatives to hear that maybe today was the perfect time to show everyone what he had been saying for years, that I was not really disabled, that I could walk if I wanted to, that I was just too dramatic to admit I enjoyed the attention. My heart slammed against my ribs as I whispered for him to stop, but he laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that echoed through the backyard, and when I tried to roll forward away from him, he yanked the wheelchair backward so abruptly that my shoulders jerked painfully and gasps rippled across the yard. The shift in momentum sent a bolt of panic through me, and for a moment, all I could focus on was the sound of my own breathing growing shallow and uneven as the crowd around us widened their circle, unconsciously turning our confrontation into a spectacle. I felt utterly exposed, trapped between the handles of my chair and the pressure of Mark's unpredictable rage, while the people who shared my blood stood watching, unsure whether to intervene or pretend everything was fine the way they always had. Grandma Rose struggled to stand under the oak tree, her voice shaking as she called out his name, but her frail tone was lost under the swell of nervous murmurs spreading across the tables. Becky, the cousin live streaming earlier, now held her phone upright again, angling it for a clear shot of us, her eyes glittering with horrified fascination because she knew something was happening that her viewers would not want to miss. Mark took a single step back, gripping the handles firmly, and that was the moment the world seemed to fall silent, the sunlight flaring too brightly, the air turning too heavy, the kind of stillness that happens right before metal bends or bones break. And in that suspended breath of time, I saw his decision settle across his features like a shadow. Then he shoved me. It was not a gentle nudge or a misguided attempt to move my chair. It was a violent, deliberate thrust fueled by alcohol rage and the twisted desire to humiliate me so thoroughly that no one would ever question him again. My wheelchair shot forward with brutal force, the wheels jolting over the uneven grass, and the sudden acceleration tore the breath from my chest as my body pitched toward the ground, helpless against the physics of the fall. The world tilted sharply, and for a split second I saw the picnic tables blur into streaks of color and faces twist into masks of shock as my chair lurched into a shallow dip in the yard, sending the front casters airborne. My stomach lurched into my throat as I flew out of the chair, weightless for a horrifying moment, before gravity seized me and my forehead collided with the edge of the wooden table with a sickening crack that reverberated through my skull like an explosion. Pain detonated behind my eyes, white and blinding, and I felt warm liquid gush down my face as my vision splintered into shards of distorted shapes and swirling colors. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs, and as I collapsed onto the ground, I heard the thud of my wheelchair crashing behind me, metal scraping against the table legs and dishes clattering to the floor in a chaotic crescendo. For a fraction of a second, the yard plunged into absolute silence, as if every person present had stopped breathing. Then a ripple of stunned gasps broke through the stillness, followed by the most devastating sound of all. A few scattered laughs, sharp, mean, nervous laughs that struck me harder than the fall because they confirmed what I had feared all along. To some of them, my suffering was entertainment. I blinked slowly, my vision dimming at the edges as the warm trickle of blood slid down my temple and pooled near my ear, and somewhere above me I heard someone whisper, "She is doing this again," like it was a performance I had chosen rather than a trauma unfolding in real time. The world blurred further until faces melted into streaks of color and the sky above me warped into a swirling haze of blue and gold, and I could no longer distinguish voices clearly, only muffled fragments drifting in and out of consciousness. Through the fog, I heard a single authoritative voice cut through the chaos. "Don't move her, do not touch her. This is a spinal trauma," and the words wove themselves through the darkness, wrapping around my fading awareness like a lifeline. Then a pair of steady hands pressed gently on either side of my head, holding me in place with practiced precision, and even as my vision narrowed to a thin, trembling line, I recognized the soothing, determined tone of the woman kneeling beside me. Dr. Lauren Whitfield, a spinal trauma specialist who had been invited as a guest, not a guardian, but had stepped into the role without hesitation, and her voice carried across the yard with a force that silenced every remaining whisper. "Call 911 now and report a possible spinal injury," she commanded, and I felt the vibrations of movement around me, though everything was fading as if I were sinking into deep water. My last clear thought before unconsciousness pulled me under was the stark, heartbreaking realization that while I lay broken on the ground, the people who should have protected me had either laughed or watched in silence, and that truth cut deeper than the impact that shattered everything. When consciousness returned, it seeped in slowly like a trembling beam of light, forcing its way through a cracked door, and for several disorienting seconds I could not tell where I was or why every sound echoed inside my skull like it was vibrating through a hollow chamber. The sterile smell reached me first, that sharp, unmistakable blend of antiseptic and warm plastic that belonged only to emergency rooms, and then I felt the pressure of a rigid cervical collar wrapped snugly around my neck, holding my head in place as though my body had been pinned to the surface of the world. My eyes fluttered open, and the harsh fluorescent lights above me fractured into blurred halos, making my vision swim before it finally began to steady enough for me to make out the ceiling tiles and the metal rail of the stretcher. A soft mechanical beeping pulsed to my right, a sound that tethered me to reality, reminding me that I was alive, even though my body felt heavy like it had been packed with wet sand. I inhaled slowly, tasting copper and dryness in my throat, and when I tried to move, the pain in my head flared with a sharpness that made my breath hitch. "Easy. Emily," a calm voice murmured beside me, and when I turned my eyes without moving my neck, I saw Dr. Lauren Whitfield leaning over me, her expression focused and steady, the kind of expression that belonged to someone who had seen injuries like mine far too many times. "You are in the emergency department at St. John's," she said carefully. "We brought you in with suspected cervical trauma concussion and lacerations. Do not try to turn your head and do not lift your shoulders." Her tone was firm but reassuring, and I felt a strange mix of fear and safety collide inside me because even though everything hurt, there was finally someone in my orbit who was acting like my well-being mattered. The memory of the fall slammed back into me, that horrifying tilt of the world, the brutal crack of my forehead against the table. The laughter, the shock, the helplessness, and the sudden certainty that my life was hanging by a thread held between the careless fingers of someone who should have cared for me. My chest tightened, and I felt tears sting my eyes, but Lauren placed a gloved hand lightly on my forearm, grounding me with her presence. "You are safe now," she said quietly, and for the first time in hours, maybe years, I almost believed someone truly meant it. A nurse appeared at my bedside, checking my vitals, adjusting the IV, and gently wiping dried blood from my temple while Lauren reviewed the CT scans displayed on the monitor. The images glowed in shades of gray and white, and although I could not interpret them, I could see the tension in her jaw as she studied them with meticulous concentration. "You have no additional spinal fractures," she finally said, turning to me with relief in her eyes, "but the impact caused swelling, and you have a moderate concussion along with several deep lacerations that required stitches. You will need monitoring and follow-up imaging, but you did not sustain catastrophic new damage." The room around me blurred with gratitude, despair, exhaustion, everything folding into each other until my breath trembled again. Then the door opened and two uniformed police officers stepped inside, their voices low and solemn as they approached the foot of the bed. "Miss Carter, one of them said we understand you experienced a fall at your family event this afternoon. We need to ask a few questions while the details are fresh and while any potential witnesses are still being identified." Before I could respond, Lauren straightened and positioned herself beside me, like a barrier made of quiet authority and medical expertise. "Officers," she said in a tone that carried the weight of unquestionable fact, "this was not a fall. This was an assault, and a violent one. I saw it happen with my own eyes." The officers exchanged a glance and moved closer, their notepads ready while my pulse thudded at the base of my skull. "Emily, can you tell us what you remember?" one asked gently, his tone careful, like he knew he was walking into something layered and fragile. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to speak, even though each word scraped against the bruises inside my mind. "My brother pushed me," I whispered, and the words trembled into the room like a confession I had been holding for 2 years. The officer asked if I meant intentionally or accidentally, and the bitterness of the question pierced me because I remembered too well how easily the world accepted excuses for men like Mark. "Intentionally," I said louder this time. "He shoved my wheelchair from behind. He meant to make me fall. He wanted to humiliate me, and he did." The room felt colder after I said it, but strangely lighter too, as though naming the truth peeled back a layer of suffocating fog. Before the officers could ask another question, the door swung open again and my parents rushed inside, their faces flushed with panic and manufactured concern, the same imitation of urgency they had worn at the hospital 2 years earlier. "Emily, oh, sweetheart," Mom cried, hurrying to my bedside as though the distance between us had not been carved out by years of denial and betrayal. We came as soon as we heard. Dad hovered behind her, avoiding eye contact with Lauren and the officers, while his jaw flexed in agitation. "Sweetheart," Mom continued, her voice trembling, "you have to tell them it was an accident. Your brother feels awful. He didn't mean to push you that hard. Everyone saw he was just joking." My stomach clenched so violently that nausea rolled through me, and I stared at her in disbelief because even after watching me bleed on the ground, even after seeing the ambulance lights reflect against the shattered table, even after knowing the past, she still expected me to lie again, to sacrifice myself again for him. Lauren stepped forward, her voice sharp enough to slice through the room. "No," she said firmly. "She will not be pressured into changing her statement. What happened today was deliberate, dangerous, and witnessed by multiple people." The officers straightened immediately, and Mom recoiled slightly, like she had been slapped by reality. "It was an accident," Dad insisted, his voice tight with frustration. "You know how Emily can be dramatic. She probably tipped forward." The betrayal hit like a punch, deep and familiar and devastating. I closed my eyes for a moment before opening them again, my voice steady but soft. He pushed me, and I am not lying for him again. The officers nodded, writing down every word, while my parents stared at me with a mixture of disbelief, anger, and dawning fear. Because for the first time in my life, I was choosing the truth over their comfort, and nothing terrified them more. The moment the officer stepped out of the room to speak with hospital security, the air inside the ER seemed to tighten around me as though the walls were drawing closer, and the fluorescent lights suddenly felt too bright, exposing every crack in the fragile facade my parents had maintained for years. Mom stood stiffly at the foot of my bed, wringing her hands in a performance of maternal distress, while Dad paced near the curtain, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles whitened as though he were searching for the right angle, the right narrative, the right lie that could still save Mark from the consequences of what he had done. "Emily, you need to think very carefully about what you are doing," Mom said, her voice trembling with forced gentleness, because underneath the softness, I could hear the brittle edge of desperation. "Families protect each other. We do not drag one another into legal trouble." I stared at her, unable to stop the disbelief from rising like a tide inside my chest. He dragged me face first into a wooden table and left me bleeding on the ground in front of everyone I said, and Mom flinched at the straightforward brutality of my words, as if she were offended by the truth more than the violence itself. Dad stopped pacing and turned to me, his expression sharp and pleading at the same time. "Honey, you know your brother has been under a lot of stress lately, work, money, relationships, all of it piling up. He had too much to drink today and things got out of hand. You fell. That is what people saw. Just tell the officers you fell." My heart lurched with a painful twist, because hearing him say it so easily made something old and wounded inside me ache with the familiarity of it. 2 years earlier, I had watched them deliver that same plea while I lay in a different hospital bed after the crash, begging me to protect Mark from a DUI charge. He was drunk then, too reckless, cruel, immune to consequences, because our parents treated him as though accountability were a punishment reserved only for me. I felt the betrayal crack open in my chest like a long sealed fault line. I did not fall. He pushed me. The moment I said it, Mom's composure cracked and she took a step closer, her voice dropping into the serious, urgent tone she used whenever she wanted to disguise manipulation as concern. "Emily, listen to me carefully. If you tell them this was intentional, they will arrest him. He could go to prison. Do you understand that prison? Do you really want that on your conscience for the rest of your life?" Something inside me snapped at her words, not with anger, but with an exhausted clarity. I wanted to ask her why she had never asked whether Mark's actions should be on his conscience, why my safety was always negotiable, why my pain was always something she expected me to swallow quietly like expired medicine. Instead, I said nothing, and her panic deepened, because silence from me meant she no longer had control. She leaned closer, lowering her voice further as if she feared the nurses might overhear. "If you do this, your brother will never forgive you, and this family will never be the same. Your grandmother does not have much time left. Do you really want her final months filled with stress because of a decision you made in anger?" That was the moment something changed inside me. The exhaustion, the fear, the shame, all of it hardened into something steadier, colder, clearer. My mother was willing to use my dying grandmother as leverage to protect the son who had nearly killed me twice. The realization settled over me like a sheet of ice. I felt my pulse quicken, but my voice when it came was soft and steady. "I am not the one who broke this family. Mark did." The words seemed to stun her, and for a moment she simply stared at me, mouth slightly open, as though she could not comprehend that I had spoken aloud the truth she had spent years burying under excuses and denial. Dad stepped forward, trying a different tactic, his voice dropping into the calm, rational tone he reserved for negotiations, or moments when he thought he could intimidate me with logic. "Emily, you are emotional right now. Head injuries can make things seem worse than they are. When you are clearer, we will revisit this conversation." I closed my eyes momentarily against the wave of disbelief, because he had just implied that my memory of being violently shoved might be a symptom rather than a fact, and yet the wetness on my cheek, the stitches on my forehead, the throbbing pressure behind my eyes, all of it told me exactly what had happened and why. When I opened my eyes again, I met his stare without flinching. I remember everything perfectly. And I am telling the truth. Dad's jaw clenched, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear for me, but fear of what my truth could cost his precious son, the heir to all of their hopes. The child they believed still had a future worth protecting. Mom reached out suddenly, grabbing my hand with an intensity that bordered on frantic. "Just tell them it was an accident, please. Emily, please do not ruin your brother's life over a misunderstanding." Her grip tightened as though she believed she could physically hold me inside the old version of myself, the compliant daughter who bent under pressure, the girl who apologized for things she never did. But I was not that girl anymore. I withdrew my hand and she gasped softly, as though the rejection wounded her more than the fact that her son had shoved me into a table. Before either of them could continue, the curtain swished open and Dr. Lauren stepped inside. Her face calm, but her eyes sharp enough to cut through every lie in the room. "Is everything all right in here?" she asked, though her gaze was already locked onto my parents, who stiffened under her scrutiny. Mom forced a smile and said we were just talking, trying to understand what really happened today. Lauren lifted an eyebrow in a way that made my father look away. "Good," she said evenly, "because hospital protocol requires that patients in potential assault cases are not pressured or coached in any way. If you would like to remain in this room, you will not attempt to influence her statement." Her tone was quiet, but so authoritative, my parents froze. Then she turned to me, softening her expression just enough. "Emily, do you need them to step out?" It was the first time in my life someone had asked me that question, someone who saw the pressure pushing down on me and offered a way out. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, but I managed to speak clearly. "Yes, please." Both my parents looked at me as if I had slapped them, but Lauren simply nodded and gestured toward the curtain. "I will give you privacy," she said, "or security can escort you if needed." Mom opened her mouth to protest, but the officers reappeared behind the curtain at that exact moment, and the sight of their uniforms drained all the defiance from her face. "We will step out," Dad muttered stiffly, grabbing Mom's arm as they left. When the curtain closed behind them, the heaviness in the room lifted slightly, as though the air itself understood that a chapter had shifted. I exhaled slowly, realizing for the first time that standing up for myself even from a hospital bed felt like the smallest, most fragile form of freedom. Once my parents were gone, the officers returned to the side of my bed, their expressions more serious than before, as though the weight of what they had learned in the hallway had shifted the entire tone of the investigation, and even though my head throbbed with every flash of fluorescent light, I felt a strange, clear awareness rising inside me as if the truth had finally found a place to stand. Officer Martinez, who had taken the initial statement, pulled up a small rolling stool and sat so that he was eye level with me, creating a gentler barrier between my vulnerability and the sterile chaos of the emergency room. "Mrs. Carter," he began calmly, "we have spoken to several individuals outside, and we understand there may be video evidence of the incident." My breath caught because I knew exactly what he meant, and a flicker of terror mixed with relief passed through me like a cold current. "Becky filmed part of it," I whispered, remembering the way she had held her phone like she was watching a show instead of witnessing violence. Before the officers could respond, the curtain parted again and a teenage girl stepped hesitantly inside. Her eyes swollen from crying, her hands shaking as she clutched her phone against her chest like it was both shield and confession. It was Becky, and the instant her gaze met mine, she burst into a sob that cracked through the room with raw guilt. "I am so sorry," she choked out before the officers gently guided her closer. I did not think he would actually do it. I thought he was just showing off like always. I did not stop recording because I froze. I panicked. I was stupid, but I have the whole thing. She unlocked her phone with trembling fingers and handed it to the officers, who watched the footage in silence for several long, excruciating seconds. The audio was muffled, but the image was unmistakably clear, the shove, the impact, the sound of the table, the gasps, and then the laughter, followed by the unmistakable panic as Dr. Lauren reached me. Even without hearing everything, the images spoke loudly enough to obliterate any lingering doubt. After reviewing it, the officers exchanged a brief, meaningful look, and one of them stepped into the hall to call their supervisor. Becky collapsed into the nearest chair, her shoulders shaking as she covered her face. I reached out instinctively, though my arm felt heavy and numb, and when my fingers brushed her hand, she looked up with a grief so deep it made my throat ache. "I never thought he would hurt you," she whispered. "He always acts like you ruined his life, but I did not think he would do something like this, I swear." Before I could respond, a tall man in a dark suit entered the room, accompanied by the second officer, and his presence carried the calm, quiet gravity of someone used to stepping into crises. He introduced himself as Attorney Michael Reeves, a representative from the County Victims Advocacy Unit, who had been called in because the case now met the criteria for felony assault involving a vulnerable adult, which meant the DA's office would likely take immediate interest. "Emily," he said, while pulling a small pad from his briefcase, "the video confirms an intentional act of violence, and because you are a mobility-impaired individual state, law classifies this as an aggravated assault against a disabled person. The penalty is significantly higher than a typical assault charge." His words felt surreal, heavy, and distant, as though they floated above me in a haze, but I forced myself to stay present, even though the room swayed slightly with each pulse of pain behind my eyes. Attorney Reeves asked me to retell everything in as much detail as possible, which I did, even though every memory felt like reopening a wound. He listened without interrupting, occasionally glancing toward Lauren for clarification on medical terms, and when I finished, he nodded slowly, the kind of nod that meant a long and complicated process had just begun. "We will also need witness statements," he said gently, and as if summoned by the words, the curtain opened again and Aunt Mary stepped inside, her face pale but resolute. "I saw everything she announced before anyone could speak, and I am ready to sign whatever statement is needed." She placed her purse on the chair, her hands shaking slightly but her spine straight, her eyes burning with something that looked like long overdue courage. "I was standing behind the grill when Mark grabbed the wheelchair," she said, "and I heard him say he was going to teach Emily a lesson. He shoved her. Hard. I will testify to that." Her voice wavered, but she did not back down, and something in my chest loosened painfully because for the first time, someone in my family was choosing truth rather than loyalty to Mark. The officers recorded her full statement, then stepped out to coordinate with additional units now stationed outside the hospital since it was standard protocol when a suspect was potentially still on the property. Attorney Reeves resumed reviewing the footage, pausing occasionally to take notes, while murmuring about timestamps, court admissibility, and chain of custody. Meanwhile, Lauren continued to monitor my vitals, her presence an anchor in the midst of the escalating storm. When the officers returned moments later, their expressions had hardened further. "We attempted to make contact with your brother, but he left the reunion before we arrived," they explained, though several witnesses reported he appeared agitated, possibly intoxicated, and was making threatening remarks about people blowing things out of proportion. "We have patrol officers searching for him now." At the mention of Mark being loose, something sharp twisted in my stomach. Not fear exactly, but the dreadful awareness that accountability had finally found him, and he was not the type to accept consequences quietly. "My parents are still here," I said quietly, and the officers exchanged another knowing glance. "We are aware, and we have instructed them not to interfere with our investigation," the officer replied, but his tone suggested it had already been an issue. Attorney Reeves leaned forward, resting his notebook on his knee. "Emily, this will likely result in a formal arrest warrant by morning, assuming your medical records support the violence indicated in the video. The district attorney may choose to pursue additional charges since the injury occurred in front of multiple witnesses. You will have legal support through our office, and we will ensure you are not forced into further contact with your brother during any stage of the process." A cold mix of relief and dread surged through me because even though justice was beginning to move forward, the emotional weight of it all settled like sandbags across my chest. Becky wiped her eyes again, whispering another apology, and Aunt Mary sat near the wall, her face etched with sadness but also determination, as though she had been waiting years for someone to stand against the family's pattern of silence. As the officers prepared to leave to process the evidence, Attorney Reeves closed his notebook and gave me a steady look. "Emily, your courage today will shape the outcome of this case. You are not alone in this." For the first time in a long time, I almost believed it. The hours that followed stretched into a strange, suspended twilight inside the hospital room, a place where fluorescent light softened just enough to make time feel blurred, but not enough to make the dread in my chest fade. And though my head pounded and my body ached with every subtle movement, the real weight pressing on me came from the knowledge that my family was somewhere in the building, no longer waiting in quiet concern, but regrouping in a state of desperation that had nothing to do with my injury and everything to do with protecting Mark from the consequences rapidly closing in. The curtain opened again and my parents stepped inside with the brittle tension of people who had spent the last hour arguing but had not reached anything resembling truth. Mom's eyes were red, not from grief, but from panic. Her mascara smudged into faint, smoky circles that made her look more haunted than heartbroken. Dad's jaw was tight the way it always was when he felt cornered, a subtle grinding motion like he was chewing on frustration and searching for a strategy at the same time. Before either of them spoke, Lauren positioned herself at my bedside, arms lightly crossed as though she intended to make it physically and emotionally clear that I was not alone nor unprotected. Mom's voice cracked as she said, "Emily, they are going to arrest him. They are talking about felony charges. Do you understand what that means for our family?" And the way she emphasized our family made something burn bitterly in my chest because she had never once emphasized my safety with the same urgency. I held her gaze silently until she continued her words, rushing out in frantic whispers. We talked to Mary, and she said she was confused that maybe she did not see everything clearly. Aunt Mary, who had bravely given a detailed statement earlier, would not have recanted anything unless pressured, and the bitterness of that realization twisted through me sharply. Dad added quickly, "She is emotional. She loves you both. She probably thinks she saw more than she did, but the officers will listen to her if she does not correct herself." His implication hung heavily between us, another attempt to rewrite events to protect Mark, and I felt the familiar exhaustion sweep through me. Before I could respond, the curtain opened abruptly and Aunt Mary stepped inside. Her face pale, but set in a firm expression that contradicted everything my parents had just claimed. She shot them a warning look and said clearly, "I did not say I was confused. I said I was upset. And I am going to tell the truth." Mom's lips pressed together in a tight line, frustration leaking out from behind her polite facade. Dad's voice dropped into a low hiss. "Mary, this is a private conversation." She ignored him and moved closer to me, reaching out to touch my arm gently. "Sweetheart, I will not let them twist this. I saw what he did, and I am ashamed I did not stop him sooner." Her words cracked open something raw inside me, something I had held together with thin, trembling threads for years. But my parents were not moved by her honesty. Instead, they turned on her with a collective desperation that made the air feel sharp and dangerous. Mom grabbed Aunt Mary's wrist and whispered fiercely, "Do you really want to tear this family apart over something blown out of proportion?" He did not mean to hurt her. It was an accident. Aunt Mary pulled her arm away, jerking back as though burned. He shoved her. Everyone saw it. The room thickened with tension as Dad stepped toward her, lowering his voice but tightening it like a rope. "You can fix this," he said quietly. "No one needs to know what you thought you saw. The officers have not sent their report yet. If you retract your statement now, maybe we can prevent things from escalating." The sickness that rolled through me in that moment was profound, a nauseating recognition of just how deep their willingness to manipulate ran, and how many years they had shaped reality to protect their golden son. But this time, Aunt Mary did not fold. She lifted her chin and said, "I am not lying for him. Not now. Not ever again." Dad's expression hardened, and I saw something cruel flicker in his eyes. Something cold that reminded me all too much of the way Mark's gaze had darkened before he shoved me. It was the family pattern, the generational inheritance of denial and aggression that I had always sensed but never fully seen until now. Lauren moved subtly closer, scanning the rising tension with the trained instinct of someone accustomed to de-escalating dangerous situations. "Enough," she said, and her voice, though calm, carried a steel that cut across the argument. This is a medical facility, and you are attempting to pressure witnesses and a patient who is under my care. If you continue, I will have hospital security escort you out." That snapped something in Dad because he turned on her with indignation. "We are her parents. We have a right to talk to her. Not when you are attempting to influence a potential felony investigation," Lauren replied, "and the officers will be notified if this continues." As if summoned, the curtain parted again, and Officer Martinez stepped in, along with a second officer, their expressions stern, as though they had overheard enough to confirm what the entire situation was becoming. "Sir, ma'am, we need to speak with you both outside," he said, and the tone suggested it was not a request. Mom shook her head, trembling. "This is insane! We are trying to keep our son from being thrown into prison for a misunderstanding." Officer Martinez looked directly at her, his face neutral but firm. "Based on statements, video evidence, and medical assessments, this was not a misunderstanding. This was a violent assault. You need to come with us now." Dad opened his mouth to protest, but then a sudden loud crash echoed through the hallway, followed by raised voices and the unmistakable thud of someone slamming against a wall. The officer nearest the door stepped into the hall, immediately, his voice projecting authority. "Back up now! Security to room 22 stat." My heart seized in my chest because I recognized that voice even from a distance. Mark. He was somewhere just outside the room, shouting, slurring angrily, demanding to see me, insisting that everyone was lying, trying to destroy him, and the sound of his rage rattled through my bones. Hospital security converged quickly, their radios crackling, while one guard pinned him back and another restrained his arms. "Let me talk to her!" he yelled, voice cracking with fury. "She is lying. She always lies. She ruined everything." The officers rushed out to assist, leaving the curtain wide open, and for a split second I saw him disheveled shirt, wrinkled sweat on his forehead, eyes wild and bloodshot as he strained against the security guards. That single glimpse shook me because it revealed the truth my family had tried to deny. He was not confused, not remorseful, not misunderstood. He was dangerous, truly dangerous, and the mask he wore for years had finally broken. Security forced him farther down the hall, his shouts fading as they moved him toward a holding alcove, but the damage was already done. Mom collapsed into a nearby chair, sobbing not out of fear for me, but out of devastation for the son she could no longer shield. Dad stood rigid, eyes hollowed out by the realization that the narrative he had crafted for years was unraveling in public view. The officers returned their expressions now cemented with certainty. Based on his behavior, the assault evidence, and witness statements, one of them said quietly, "There is no doubt an arrest warrant will be issued." My parents looked at me then with something twisted in their stares. Not sorrow, not love, but the stunned recognition that the control they once held over me had finally slipped away. And for the first time in my life, I did not feel small beneath their disappointment. I felt free. The courthouse felt colder than any place I had ever been, not because of the air conditioning, but because every step I took inside that long, echoing hallway carried the weight of 2 years of silence, 2 years of swallowing pain, 2 years of pretending the world had not collapsed the night my brother destroyed my spine and walked away unscathed. Now, months after the reunion incident, I rolled toward the courtroom with Attorney Reeves at my side, navigating the polished floors, while the subtle squeak of my wheelchair echoed beneath the high ceilings like a quiet reminder of everything that had been taken from me. Reporters stood behind velvet ropes, whispering urgently as they checked notes and snapped photos even though no cameras were permitted inside. The case had drawn attention not because I was someone important, but because the video of a disabled woman being violently shoved at a family gathering had circulated far beyond our community, making it impossible for the DA to ignore. My stomach twisted as I adjusted my position in the chair, steadying my breathing the way the physical therapist had taught me. When the courtroom doors opened, a low murmur passed through the crowd, as though some signal had rippled across the gallery, and I caught sight of faces both familiar and unwelcome. My parents sat together near the front, their bodies tense, their expressions drawn with dread, but still united in their refusal to face what their son had done. Mom clutched a wrinkled tissue, twisting it in her hands as though she were bracing for a verdict that might destroy the fragile illusion she had clung to for years. Dad stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, shifting uncomfortably whenever someone looked at him for too long. They had not visited me since the hospital, but they had shown up for Mark every court date as though their presence could shield him from the consequences he had earned. Mark sat at the defense table dressed in a suit that did not fit him quite right. His posture slouched, his expression flat with irritation rather than remorse. His wrists were free today, but his movements were twitchy, restless. His eyes darting between the judge, the prosecutors, and the gallery as though searching for someone who might still take his side. When his gaze finally landed on me, something bitter and sharp flickered in his eyes, a mix of anger and disbelief that I had actually followed through, that he was actually sitting here because of me. I held his stare without flinching, though my pulse hammered in my throat. The bailiff called the court to order, and we all rose except for me and 3 other individuals seated in wheelchairs. The judge entered a woman in her early 60s, with a stern face softened only by her silver-framed glasses and the calm authority of someone who had spent decades cutting through lies to reach truth. She reviewed the charges in a clear, steady voice: aggravated assault against a disabled individual, reckless endangerment, intentional infliction of bodily harm, and obstruction for his attempt to rush the hospital hallway during the investigation. Each word struck the room like a gavel strike. And although Mark shifted uncomfortably, he did not look surprised. He had been briefed. He simply did not believe any of it applied to him. The prosecution presented first, playing the video on a large screen positioned beside the jury box. Even though I had seen it before, the moment the footage began, my breath caught painfully as the exact instant of the shove replayed in slow, undeniable clarity. The jury watched in stunned silence, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads as the sound of my body hitting the table filled the room, amplified through the speakers. I could not look away, even though the memory scraped raw against my insides, because witnessing the truth through someone else's lens somehow made it real in a way it had never been allowed to be inside my family's narrative. Next came witness testimony. Becky spoke first, her voice trembling as she described filming the video not for entertainment, but out of fear that something bad might happen. Her guilt painted her words, but her courage carried them, and when she stepped down from the stand, I mouthed, "Thank you." She wiped her eyes and nodded. Then Aunt Mary took the stand and delivered one of the strongest testimonies I had ever heard her voice, unwavering as she recounted everything she saw, everything she heard, everything she wished she had stopped. When the defense attempted to rattle her questioning her memory, she straightened her shoulders and said clearly, "I know what I saw, and I will not lie for anyone, not anymore." The courtroom shifted at those words, a subtle but palpable change like the collective exhale of dozens of people who had been holding their breath. Dr. Lauren testified next, explaining with precise medical language the severity of the fall, the danger posed by the force of the impact, and the way my existing spinal injuries made the event life-threatening. She ended with a firm statement that left the defense stunned. This was not a clumsy accident. This was a violent act. The defense tried to paint Mark as a misunderstood brother under stress, claiming he had meant only to push the chair slightly or playfully, but the video destroyed that narrative instantly. When it came time for Mark to speak, he took the stand reluctantly, and his testimony unraveled before it even began. He started with excuses, then switched to blaming me, accusing me of exaggerating, even suggesting I had thrown myself forward to get attention. A ripple of disbelief passed through the courtroom, and even a few jurors exchanged shocked glances. The prosecutor calmly asked him why he fled the reunion, why security had to restrain him at the hospital, why he threatened witnesses, and for each question, he stumbled, grasping for answers that contradicted earlier statements. By the time he stepped down, his credibility had collapsed completely. Finally, Attorney Reeves called me to the stand. Every muscle in my body trembled slightly as I raised my right hand and swore to tell the truth, something I had been doing for months without anyone in my family choosing to hear it. I described the shove, the terror, the impact, the laughter, the betrayal, the hospital, the pressure to lie. The years before the fall, when my family had shaped a world in which my pain was always secondary to Mark's reputation. The courtroom was silent when I finished silent in a way that felt reverent, not pitying. When the judge read the verdict, the words seemed to echo inside my rib cage long after they left her lips. Guilty on all counts. Mark stood frozen as though he had expected a last-minute miracle to save him, but there was none. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in state prison with mandatory anger management and restrictions on contacting me. Mom gasped. Dad's shoulders slumped and Mark cursed loudly before the bailiff handcuffed him and escorted him away. But through all of it, I felt something steady rise inside me, something warm and fierce and long overdue. Justice. In the weeks following the verdict, the world outside the courthouse seemed strangely quieter, as though the noise that had followed me for years had finally begun to fade, leaving behind an unfamiliar but welcome stillness that felt both fragile and empowering. The first morning after Mark was taken into custody, I woke in my apartment to a stream of sunlight filtering through the curtains, and for the first time since the accident 2 years earlier, I realized my body did not immediately brace for the sound of someone yelling or the pressure of someone demanding I rewrite the truth. Instead, there was only the soft hum of the heater, the gentle creak of the old wooden floorboards, and the faint chirp of a bird outside the window. All of it forming a peaceful symphony I had never allowed myself to imagine. Attorney Reeves called that afternoon, checking on me in the calm, measured tone he always used, and assuring me that protective orders were now active, preventing Mark from contacting me in any way. He also mentioned that social services had reached out to my parents regarding their attempts to pressure witnesses and interfere with the investigation, though no formal charges had been filed. The news did not surprise me, but it did leave an echoing ache in my chest because even though they had chosen their path, their willingness to violate the law for their son remained a wound I was still learning to navigate. I spent several days in a haze of exhaustion healing from the trial mentally and physically, until one afternoon I rolled across my living room and caught sight of the framed picture on my shelf, a photo of me and my grandmother seated on her porch the summer before my accident. She had passed away a month before the trial began, leaving behind a void I still felt sharply and a letter I had not opened until the day of the verdict. In that letter written in her trembling cursive, she told me she hoped I would one day learn that my worth was not determined by how much pain I could endure to keep others comfortable. And reading her words again filled me with a sense of grounding so deep it steadied the trembling inside me. The next step was harder, distancing myself from my parents, not with loud arguments or final declarations, but with quiet, intentional space. When they called the day after sentencing, I let the phone ring until it fell silent. And when Mom left a voicemail crying about how the family was shattered and begging me to reconsider, I listened only long enough to understand she was not asking about my well-being, only about her grief at losing her son to the consequences he had earned. I deleted the message and placed the phone aside, feeling both sorrow and relief settle into me like 2 layers of sediment finally separating. In the following weeks, I removed them from my emergency contacts, updated my medical records, requested my therapist help me create boundaries strong enough to withstand the emotional storms that always accompanied them, and slowly unraveled the threads of obligation that had bound me to their dysfunction. The freedom that followed was not immediate, and it was not glamorous. It was quiet, like learning to breathe again after spending years just surviving. Small victories accumulated. I attended my physical therapy sessions without interruption. I bought groceries without anxiety gripping my chest. I rolled through the park near my apartment, watching kids race down the bike path and dogs tug their leashes and couples share cups of coffee, all simple moments that once felt unreachable, but now offered a hint of what my life could be. One afternoon while drinking tea on my balcony, I received a text from Aunt Mary asking if she could visit. When she arrived, she hugged me tightly and apologized not for testifying, but for all the years before when she had looked away. I told her I forgave her, though forgiveness was less a moment and more a choice. I was learning to make one breath at a time. She visited often after that, bringing meals, showing me photos of her grandchildren, encouraging me to reconnect with the parts of life that had nothing to do with trauma or survival. Slowly, a new kind of family formed around me, not bound by blood, but by honesty, support, and a willingness to grow. My relationship with Dr. Lauren also deepened, though not in the way people expected. She became a steady presence, checking in after appointments, bringing me research about adaptive driving programs, and reminding me that independence did not have to mean isolation. One day, after a follow-up exam, she surprised me by offering to connect me with a local support group for women recovering from family-based trauma. I hesitated at first, but agreed, and attending those meetings became a turning point. Listening to their stories, recognizing my own pain, reflected in their voices, and sharing my experience without fear of being told I was exaggerating helped something locked inside me begin to thaw. Meanwhile, small changes in my daily routine marked a shift in my identity. I started volunteering with a local disability advocacy organization, helping others navigate the challenges I had once felt crushed beneath. I reacquainted myself with my love for community health work, something I abandoned after the accident because returning to it meant confronting a version of myself I was not sure existed anymore. But one crisp morning, as I rolled into a volunteer shift, the coordinator greeted me with genuine warmth, and for the first time, I believed I might still have something meaningful to offer the world. My apartment slowly transformed too. I removed the pictures of my parents, replacing them with art I loved. I rearranged furniture to make it easier to move around, not because of necessity, but because I wanted my home to reflect the sense of freedom blooming inside me. I hung my grandmother's quilt on the wall above my bed, a reminder of her quiet strength and unconditional love. As the weeks turned into months, I realized something extraordinary. I no longer woke in fear. I no longer questioned my memory. I no longer treated survival as my only purpose. Instead, I found myself looking ahead, imagining a future that did not revolve around my family's storms or Mark's shadow, a future that belonged to me. And perhaps the clearest sign of liberation came on a day when my phone buzzed again, displaying my mother's name. Instead of dread, I felt only acceptance. I let it ring. I let it stop. And I went on with my day without looking back. Healing did not arrive in a single sweeping moment of clarity, but rather through a slow accumulation of ordinary days that carried their own kind of quiet magic, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to experience life without measuring each step against the shadows of my past. In the early weeks after distancing myself from my family, I continued physical therapy with renewed commitment, motivated not by desperation, but by a gradual rediscovery of hope. And every time my therapist encouraged me to push my boundaries a little further, I felt a spark of strength return to my muscles and my spirit. Even on the difficult days when the exercises seemed too demanding and my body trembled with fatigue, something inside me refused to quit because this time I was doing it not to convince anyone else of my worth, but to reclaim it for myself. I joined the support group Lauren recommended, and walking, or rather rolling into that room for the first time, felt like crossing a threshold I had spent years circling but never entering. The women there welcomed me with empathy rather than pity, and as they shared stories of abandonment, manipulation, and survival, I felt threads of understanding weave between us, forming a tapestry of resilience stronger than any one of us alone. When my turn came to speak, my voice cracked, but I kept talking, describing not only the shove at the reunion, but the years of emotional erosion that came before it. And when I finished, the room was silent, not with judgment, but with recognition. A shared acknowledgement that we had all been shaped by storms, yet remained standing in our own ways. Over the next several weeks, those meetings became a sanctuary where I learned to unpack emotions I had buried beneath armor, fear, and silence. One evening, after a particularly raw discussion about grief, I found myself lingering in the parking lot beside my adapted car, breathing in the cool evening air while watching the streetlights blur through my tears. That night, something shifted. Instead of feeling broken, I felt softened, and instead of drowning in sorrow, I felt myself begin to rise gently above it. Lauren continued to be a steady presence in my healing journey, meeting me for tea after appointments or sending encouraging messages before court-related follow-ups. And even though our relationship remained professional, there was a warmth in her support that helped tether me to the present whenever memories threatened to pull me backward. She was the one who encouraged me to explore adaptive driving lessons again, and despite my initial reluctance, I agreed. Learning to drive from a seated position that no longer matched the one I had grown up with felt daunting, But when I took the wheel for the first time, my instructor reminded me that freedom rarely arrives without a little fear. Slowly, I began to understand the truth in that. Each lesson strengthened my confidence, and the first time I successfully completed a driving route without assistance, I felt a surge of triumph so powerful it brought tears to my eyes. My world expanded beyond hospital rooms and legal offices into parks, libraries, cafes, and volunteer centers where I began helping others navigate disability resources. Many of the people I met were facing their own battles: stigma, unemployment, inaccessible environments, or painful family dynamics. And as I listened to their stories, I realized how much compassion had grown inside me from surviving my own hardship. It felt meaningful to offer guidance where I could, connecting them with agencies, therapists, or mobility specialists, and sometimes simply being a listening ear when their burdens felt too heavy. Those connections reminded me that healing did not have to be solitary. One of the biggest steps occurred when I enrolled in a community health certification course that would allow me to return to the field I loved before the accident. Sitting in a classroom again, surrounded by students of all ages, filled me with nervous excitement. And although navigating campus required planning and patience, I found myself looking forward to each lecture, each discussion, each chapter of the textbook. My mind felt alive again, and even though my body still had limits, the joy of learning restored something deep inside me. Gradually, I noticed small changes in my emotional landscape. The nightmares that once jolted me awake began to fade, replaced by dreams of quiet mornings and open fields. The tension that used to coil in my shoulders whenever my phone buzzed no longer triggered panic because I no longer feared my family using guilt as a weapon. Even my reflection in the mirror looked different, not in appearance, but in expression. My eyes held something steady and calm, something I had not seen since childhood. One morning, while rolling through the park, I came across a small outdoor concert, and as the musicians played a soft folk melody, I found myself closing my eyes, letting the sun warm my face and the breeze brush against my hair. In that moment, I felt a fullness in my chest, a quiet joy that took root not because life was perfect, but because I had finally allowed myself to feel it. Healing also meant acknowledging the grief that still surfaced from time to time, especially when holidays approached, or when I saw families laughing together unaware of how fragile their harmony could be. Sometimes I cried missing the family I once imagined I had instead of the one I truly had, and other times I felt anger flare when memories resurfaced of moments when love should have protected me but failed. But instead of letting those emotions consume me, I learned to sit with them, to breathe through them, to understand they were part of my healing rather than obstacles to it. My therapist often reminded me that healing is not the absence of pain, but the integration of it, learning to move forward with the knowledge of what happened without letting it define what comes next. Slowly, I began believing that. As the months passed, I built friendships that felt rooted in authenticity rather than obligation. Friendships with people who cared not because they shared my blood, but because they saw my heart. I celebrated birthdays with them, attended concerts, joined group hikes where accessible trails showcased the beauty of Montana's landscapes, and one evening sat around a fire pit roasting marshmallows and laughing in a way I had not allowed myself to laugh in years. I realized that the family I needed was not the one I had been born into, but the one I had chosen, the one that chose me back. And perhaps the clearest sign of healing came the day I rolled past a bakery window and caught my reflection. Instead of seeing a girl who had survived a brother's violence, I saw a woman standing tall in her own way, calm, strong, and finally free. The morning the final chapter of this story truly began did not arrive with fanfare, but with a quiet warmth that settled over my life like a long-awaited sunrise. And as I sat beside the calm surface of Clearwater Lake, watching the first light stretch across the water, I felt a sense of stillness I had never known in all the years I spent desperately trying to earn love from people who had never intended to give it freely. The air carried the scent of pine and early summer blossoms, and a gentle breeze brushed against my skin, while the wheelchair beneath me hummed softly from the upgrades I had recently installed, a small gift I allowed myself after years of denying that I deserved comfort. As the sun climbed, I opened the small envelope that had arrived 2 days earlier from the state correctional facility, and though part of me expected a wave of fear or anger, what I felt instead was something quieter. Perhaps not forgiveness, but distance, a soft unclenching of an old wound. The letter inside was written in Mark's uneven handwriting, and the first line was simple. Emily, I finally understand. I read it slowly, letting every word settle. He wrote about those long days in confinement when the walls forced him to confront the echoes of things he had tried to ignore for years. The drinking, the cruelty, the entitlement, the belief that he could take from others without consequence, because someone would always shield him from fallout. He wrote about anger therapy mandated classes, and the moment a counselor told him that accountability is the first doorway to becoming someone different, and he admitted that for most of his life he had walked the opposite direction. Near the end of the letter, he wrote, I know I broke your body and your trust and your peace. I know my words cannot fix any of that. I do not expect anything from you, but I needed to say I am sorry. Reading it, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness, just a quiet understanding that apologies are seeds, and not all seeds are meant to be planted. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, letting it rest in my lap as the sun continued to rise across the water. I did not write back. I did not need to. Once upon a time, I would have shaped my life around the hope of reconciliation, but now I understood that healing sometimes means allowing a chapter to close without reopening it for inspection. The day moved forward peacefully, and I spent the afternoon in town meeting Lauren for lunch on the patio of a small cafe overlooking Main Street. She greeted me with the warm steadiness that had defined every step of my recovery, and as we talked about her research, new patients, and my plans for the future, I noticed how natural it felt to share my life with someone who saw me not as a burden or symbol of family shame, but as a whole person capable of rebuilding and expanding. When I told her about my acceptance into the Community Health Certification Program, she smiled with genuine pride, and her encouragement wrapped around me like sunlight through a window. After lunch, I rolled through the local farmers market, sampling honey and freshly baked bread, chatting with neighbors, and feeling utterly present in a way I had never thought possible during the months after the reunion. People recognized me now, not because I had been the center of a scandal, but because I volunteered at the health center, mentored teens with mobility challenges, helped organize workshop nights, and showed up for the community in ways that filled my days with meaning. In the evening, I returned to Clearwater Lake, accompanied by friends who had become chosen family. Together, we set up a small picnic along the shoreline, laughing as we shared stories and passed around lemonade. When the sky shifted into soft shades of gold and blue, I quietly rolled a short distance away, letting the serenity of the scene wash over me. I watched the reflection of the sky ripple across the lake surface and felt an overwhelming sense of arrival, as though I had finally stepped into the life I had been reaching toward for years without realizing it. And then, almost without thinking, I placed my hand on the wheel of my chair and whispered to myself, I am here, not surviving, not pretending, not shrinking for anyone. Here. Whole, free. Later, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting the world in a gentle twilight, I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who believed that love required sacrifice, silence, and enduring harm for the sake of a broken family image. I wished I could reach back into the past and tell her that none of that was true, that love which demands the destruction of oneself is not love at all. That freedom is real, that chosen family is real, that life stretches far beyond the narrow walls of the pain she once called home. When the first stars appeared, I felt a calm certainty settle inside me, a quiet knowing that this new beginning belonged entirely to me. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, but I did not look. Whatever message waited there could wait until morning, because tonight my heart belonged to peace. I looked out at the water once more, the reflection of the sky shimmering like a promise, and whispered the final truth of my journey, not for anyone else but for myself. I was not pushed down anymore. I finally stood tall in my own way. If you have ever lived through a moment when the people who were supposed to protect you chose instead to ignore your pain or excuse the behavior of someone who hurt you, then I want you to take a deep breath right here with me because this part of the story is for you. So many of us grow up being told that family is sacred, that blood is thicker than water, that loyalty means staying silent, even when silence destroys us from the inside out. But stories like Emily's remind us of something far more powerful, something that often goes unspoken until someone finally breaks the cycle. You are allowed to walk away from people who harm you, even if those people share your last name. You are allowed to tell the truth, even when others beg you to bury it for the sake of appearances. You are allowed to protect your body, your mind, your dignity, and your future, even if doing so means standing alone for a moment until healthier people arrive in your life and show you what real support feels like. If you are watching this from a city, a small town, a ranch, a high-rise, or a quiet house, anywhere across America or anywhere in the world, I want to hear from you. Tell me where you are watching from, because every time someone shares their city, it reminds others that these stories travel farther than any of us imagine, and that someone out there might be feeling less alone because you chose to speak. And if you have ever lived through a family dynamic that made you shrink yourself or doubt your own worth, I want you to know that there are thousands of people in this community who understand exactly what that feels like. You are not dramatic for remembering what they did. You are not unforgiving for protecting yourself. You are not weak for being hurt by the people who should have loved you better. Comment below and tell me, have you ever reached a moment when you finally said enough and chose yourself, even when your family did not choose you? You do not need to share details if you do not want to. Even a simple yes or I understand can let someone else know they are not the only one carrying memories that ache when touched. And if this story resonated with you in any way, please let me know by commenting or sharing, because these stories are not just entertainment. They are reminders that justice does happen, healing does happen, and sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is choose a life that looks different from the one they were born into. So tell me your city. Tell me your thoughts. Tell me if you have ever walked away from someone who tried to break you and found strength standing on the other side. I am here, and this community is here. You are not alone.